Hi, I'm Brice Ominski, and this is the Chief Architect Forum. Today, our guest is Craig Slack from Invero. Craig, welcome on board.
Thank you, Brice.
Craig, we're going to be talking about FinOps today. We're going to be going into a lot of background. Craig, tell us, how did you get into wanting to optimize value with your clients? I think you started as far back as 1994, and in 2016 you started with Invero.
Yep.
How did you get on that route, and what did you do? Let's hear a bit about yourself there, Craig.
For sure, yeah. So as you said, I'm the CTO and founder of Invero. Just very briefly, Invero is an IT services firm focused on helping clients, maximize the value of the cloud, mostly on the Microsoft Azure side. So we're very Azure focused, but anything in the Azure world, from the infrastructure to app modernization, data analytics, and artificial intelligence is kind of all where we dabble. Myself personally, how I got into this FinOps world was before FinOps was even a term and before it was cool. My first experience with the cloud was in 2009, built a SaaS product on AWS, and I came from the enterprise IT on-prem data center kind of traditional infrastructure path in the career. And I took that mentality into the cloud. But once I started seeing how IaaS workloads operate in the cloud, and you can spin up much larger resources than you need, I saw a lot of waste occurring, and especially in large enterprises where there's resource sprawl that occurs. And so before there was, in the Azure world, Azure Cost Management didn't exist, and all the tools that are even third-party tools that exist today. I was always taking the mentality of, how do we manage this to maximize value? And I wasn't really thinking in terms of FinOps as a phrase, but more just maximizing value. Because in the traditional on-prem world, you can spin up a very large, big piece of iron, throw lots of VMs on it, whether you're VMware, Hyper-V, and you can over-provision and oversubscribe those resources, and there's no additional capital cost to the organization or even OpEx cost. Whereas I quickly saw in the cloud how that you pay for what you use model can get very expensive. And we can get into some of our client experiences that we've seen where companies have just said, yeah, we're going to move everything to the cloud, lift and shift, and then we're done. And then they get the bills at the 2-3 months in before things have been kind of right sized and whatever, and they start getting sticker shock. So if it's done with that pure infrastructure mentality, it can run away from you. The cost can.
A lot of time as architects, we're very interested in getting value out of what we architect and going from strategy to execution, tracking KPIs. And a lot of times we're talking about KPIs here that are going to really hit the CFO and making sure he has value. How do you make sure that you cross those worlds and communicate with the different people? What are your challenges there?
I think the challenge is this is a new muscle for architects and for engineers on the technology side, or anybody really on the technology side. For CFOs and the finance folks in an organization, this is normal. They look at value, and before they commit to an investment, maybe it's a large capital investment, they're going to run through their business case and see what the ROI is. From a historical technology deployment standpoint, that wasn't the mentality. It was, we're going to go out and get a business case, estimate what we think it's going to cost to deploy, but there was not traditionally, I guess I want to just, this is a generalized statement, there was not that mentality of, well, what's it going to take to operate this? Once the iron's in the data center, all the HVAC and cooling, whatever, all the costs to operate it were not as often in that business case up front. So because it was already on shared infrastructure. Whereas in the cloud, these are net new costs that are being incurred and committed to. So I think the approach from a design perspective is trying to define the business use case. What are the KPIs that are relevant to that specific solution that's being designed? And does it generate more revenue for the company? Does it, produce costs or productivity gains? And then how do you quantify that and then compare that to what's the ongoing operating cost going to be? So you can predict what the architecture may be. When you start getting into design and implementation, you may realize that, oh, well, the assumptions were incorrect, or we have to make some adjustments, maybe going down a different path. Leveraging paths, for example, if you're rather than just IaaS, you've got some other complexities to think about, but you can get some cost savings and benefits there. So I think driving that value thought process to the early stage, kind of shift left, if you want to say it that way, is important in this context.
Craig, how do you manage, and I'm thinking there's a role for governance with FinOps here.
Mm.
Are they like, how do you make sure that they're sort of connected together? Who needs to be at that table to make sure that you can, I guess, understand the implications of what's happening in your
Mm-hmm.
cloud environment?
Excellent question. Good governance is key. Number one, I think one of the big pillars of FinOps is, if you're familiar with the FinOps Foundation, they've got a framework that's defined. There's 22 areas of domains and capabilities, 4 domains, 22 capabilities, and governance is spans some of the multiple of those areas, and it could be around governance around, the consumption. So that's the cost side of things. It could be around performance metrics. Are we performing to the right levels? Are we over provisioned and those sort of things? So without that governance in place, there's a chance that, well, I'll just kind of back up. The benefits of the cloud is the democratization of access to infrastructure and to deployments. And you can get a much higher pace of the organization moving from a technology adoption perspective. So if you're, if you got lots of fingers in the pie, people who have access to deploy resources, without that governance in place, you're going to end up with massive resource sprawl. There's no guidelines on, well, you can't spin up a 64 core machine without going through these checks and balances, as an example. So putting that governance in place, and it's going to be different for every organization, what level of governance is important. But FinOps is really grounded in that governance, those governance principles, to make sure that what is designed is ultimately what's being delivered. Because, from an architecture standpoint, you could deploy something, design it, and then it gets deployed, implemented, and you move on to the next engagement, next solution that you're designing. But the governance will allow you to then track that throughout the life cycle of that application or workload, whatever's been deployed, to make sure that the assumptions up front were met downstream, and then maybe some optimization needs to be done at a later stage.
One question that comes to mind, and I'm going to sort of ask it a bit sooner rather than later. There's a lot of new technology coming forward right now. There's things like AI, and I think there's both the promise of using AI in FinOps, which is interesting, as well as being able to manage it. So I could see costs really spiraling pretty quickly with that. Are most organizations ready to do this right now?
That's a great question, and I don't think there's a single answer, but I would say my personal feeling is, yeah, most organizations are not ready. In our client base, we've seen a lot of customers go down the path of, okay, we're migrating to the cloud because we want to be able to take advantage of all the benefits that we can get for shared infrastructure, AI, all that sort of thing. So they're migrating to the cloud, or they're already in the cloud, and then they start wanting to adopt AI workloads without a clear understanding of what is the business benefit, because getting that use case right for AI has been a challenge for a lot of our clients that we're seeing in the organizations. I think in general, if you read the material out there, that's the number one area is we don't want to commit too much to AI without knowing what the use case is, and then obviously what the return on investment will be. But with AI, it also has the ability to spiral, as you said, spiral your costs out of control, because some of these workloads are very expensive if you look at token-based charging methods. So the resources you get charged are not for the compute, it's more for how much data are you pushing through that AI or the LLM. And then if without controls and get back to governance around how you're going to manage the amount of tokens, you may end up with a solution that's sending tons of data to the LLMs that it doesn't necessarily need to, and you get, again, surprise bills a few months down the road, and leadership is asking a lot of questions because they're not seeing the value yet, because there's going to be a delay between when those costs start being incurred to when the organization achieves the value.
So a company's sort of at this threshold, they're looking to do something. What are the first steps to engage with FinOps and monitor? I guess really it's about this feedback and monitoring. And I want to sort of also do this in mind with what happens when things either go well. What does that look like? And what if they don't go well? How do you back out of that?
From a FinOps perspective only, what goes well and not goes well?
Yeah, or generally, right? And I'm
Yeah.
thinking FinOps is like my guess would be FinOps is probably the early indicator. It's like the canary in the coal mine
Yeah.
that you want to be tracking to sort of, strike. Okay, there's an event here we need to deal with, but maybe not. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think your question about where to get started is a key one. As I mentioned, there's 22 capabilities in the FinOps framework as defined by the FinOps Foundation. Um, I think it can be overwhelming if an organization tries to say, okay, we're going to do FinOps and we're going to do all of these things and we're going to do them well. That's setting yourself up for failure. So starting off small, the saying of how do you eat an elephant, just one bite at a time, right? So there's a lot of work to do when it talks about fully maturing a FinOps practice. But when you start off small, a lot of organizations just start off thinking FinOps is about cost optimization. So they do some concerted efforts, and this is a good example of where it doesn't work well. You start off just looking at cost optimization and say you're able to dive in and get your costs down by 20, 30%. Give yourself a pat on the back and say, yeah, we're good, and move on. Well, if you haven't built all the underlying practices and the FinOps practices and that governance piece, this costs are gonna start to rise again because there's nobody keeping their eyes on it. They're focused on other things, and then there'll be another 6 or 12 months later. It'll be a huge cost optimization effort to get the cost down, and then without the governance, it'll keep going back up again.
So I just want to just dwell on that a little bit. That's something that
Mm,
could really sneak by pretty easily. I mean,
absolutely.
I could see in some of the leadership teams, somebody goes, "Yeah, we got the cost down. Hooray, let's party." And then
Hmm.
2 months later, what's happening here? Have you dealt with that kind of situation? Like, and,
More
and how do
times
you
than
deal with
not.
it? Yeah, and how do you deal with? I mean, there's probably going to be a lot of expectations not met and finger
Hmm.
pointing, and how do you get it out of that realm to get something
Well, I
working?
think after the second or third time of seeing this, spikes and valleys, peaks and valleys, organizations get it that the message we try to convey is that you need all the underpinnings. You need the FinOps practices in place. It can't just be, a point in time optimization effort. But so it's getting the people in place. There's a three pillars of this stool, right? People, process,
Yep.
and technology. Another example of what we've seen doesn't work well is companies go out and spend tens of thousands of dollars on a tool, a FinOps tool, and they say, "Oh, we're doing FinOps. The tool is doing it for us, or it's telling us where we can save costs." But the tool is only one of those pieces, one of those pillars of the stool. So if you don't have the people, meaning at least one person or a fraction of a person's role assigned to be in charge of FinOps and being, holistically looking at this for the organization, or better yet, a team with multiple skill sets. And then the processes, that's where the governance pieces come into play. So having processes so that, as I said earlier, shifting left when you're designing a solution from an architecture standpoint, there are processes in place to get the design approved. Maybe it's an early view to the change approval board to present the architecture and say, okay, this is going to have this much impact on cost when it's in production, and is that in the budget, or maybe we need to go back to the drawing board and have a different design. So that's where the three-legged stool comes into play. You need the people and process as well as technology.
What works on the people side? Who should own that? What skill sets should they have?
Hmm.
And is that an architect? Is that an engineer? And ultimately, where would an IT architect fit into that?
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
That's a great question too. I think the skill sets are new that are being developed. The FinOps Foundation has, I can't remember how many tens of thousands of members now. These are contributing members, but also participants, and they run an annual conference that I've attended. And there's a lot of thought leaders and practitioners that attend that. The skill sets, you know, that I've seen where people come up kind of from an analyst perspective, whether it's a business analyst or somebody who's able to look at the data, that they really jump into the numbers and they're able to really analyze everything that's being thrown at them. I think that's a skill set that is required to be able to work with an architect. So the role of the architect in this scenario is to help understand what the costs are going to be. So coming up with a design, the architecture for a solution, then translating that down, whether it's the architect doing it or working with some engineers to figure out, okay, what's the operating cost going to be of this in the cloud? what sizing do we need to go with, what SKUs, and then translate that into what is the monthly cost going to be. And then working with the analysts, the FinOps practitioners to determine, okay, that's the operating cost. What's the benefit to the organization? So that's the other side of the equation to figure out, is this a positive relationship? Are we spending less than the company is going to get in return?
In terms of modernization, if we look at refactoring versus rehosting, when
Mm-hmm.
is the sweet spot to move to the cloud?
Okay. The
Yeah.
sweet spot, yeah, it's, I think the first step is that migration. So lift and shift could be the easy first step. We do see some organizations that don't see value in lift and shift and they just want to go, modernize as they go. It just takes a longer time. It is a longer process because, some of those shared services, especially like large data warehouse or, some databases that are shared across applications, you can't move those in one big bang if there's going to be some applications left on-prem. So there's some complexities there, but I don't think there's any right way to jump into the cloud first. It's whatever's right for the organization, but making sure that modernization effort is included in the roadmap. Because if you're not planning, if you just figure you move to the cloud and running VMs on the cloud, you're not getting the true value that the cloud offers. And also you're keeping around skill sets and resources that have to manage those VMs, they have to manage backups and so on, that maybe aren't as valuable to your organization as higher level, higher order skills.
And I imagine as you do that roadmap, you definitely want to tie that into what are the benefits at this point? Are we achieving them? What are the cost reductions and the, I guess, refocuses that we're going to do with staffing and skill sets to make it move
Absolutely.
and retooling so that you're tracking that all on target. What
Absolutely.
happens? What happens when that goes wrong? You're following your roadmap, and now you're off the rails. And I mean, I guess there's a point where you say, yeah, we're within tolerances, but then there's also a point when you might say, this is the rails. And how do you decide and go forward?
Yeah, we've had a few customers over the years who get that sticker shock once they're in the cloud and they're like, this is way more expensive than I thought. And there's also a transition period when they're rolling off of the old CapEx model to OpEx. So they may still have some depreciation that is hitting their P&L for capital costs from years past, and they're now increasing OpEx through cloud spend. So we've seen some customers kind of say, okay, we're going back to the cloud or back to on-prem. It was a failed experiment, and that's usually where we step in and try to say, okay, maybe you're doing it wrong. Maybe how you've adopted the cloud is not necessarily in an optimal fashion. Let's look at
Okay.
modernizing, or let's look at additional ways to save. So it's not just a pure dollars for dollars. What are the ancillary benefits, the non-quantifiable or harder to quantify benefits of the cloud that, now that your data and applications are all hosted in one cloud or multi-cloud, what are the additional benefits that we can now achieve by leveraging, say, some of those out-of-the-box AI solutions, because now they're not having to traverse the internet to come back to your data on-prem. It's all in the cloud. So, yeah,
Well, and
that.
that's a great point. I think a lot of clients are going in, and I've come across this myself, where they're going to the cloud, but they're moving like in the same architecture that they've had on-prem. So
Yes,
they've replicated every server, and they're wondering why it's so expensive
yes.
when maybe they didn't have to do it. What are the biggest issues in that migration where we can save money in terms of thinking about getting a better target architecture?
A lot of the mistakes that we see made is exactly what you described there, is doing it exactly the same way on-prem and now doing it the same way in the cloud. So, for example, looking at on-prem architecture required X amount of CPUs, X amount of memory, X amount of disk. It's quantifying. I think the important step is to quantify how much of that is used, because you can always scale it in the cloud once you're there as requirements increase. But oftentimes it's not looked at as, okay, we over provisioned on-prem just so that we didn't have to keep, rebuilding the whole system, because it's much more painful to do it on-prem, whereas in the cloud you just increase the SKU or scale the device with a minimal downtime. It's way easier in the cloud. So I think just not repeating those old habits and scrutinizing it, getting it down to a much tighter window of what's the excess capacity you actually need in the cloud, and don't pay for what you don't need today. Pay for that tomorrow.
And I guess the next thought is you're moving to the cloud and there's all this wonderful AI. How do I open that world up? What is the minimal set of steps that I need to do to prepare for that?
Number one is getting your data in order. We've worked with a number of clients that are all excited about AI and they want to jump in with both feet. And then we hit a roadblock because they don't have data quality, or they've got the data that they have is not, you can't categorize it or you can't tag it to specific decisions that enable AI to make some inferences of, right? So throwing unstructured data at AI can be good, but if the AI can't tell, what that data is telling it, then you lose the value. So we've had a number of AI initiatives get sidelined or at least derailed through those scenarios. So getting your data estate modernized is a key thing. So we're working with a number of clients around setting up these data pipelines to ingest data from on-prem into the cloud, and going with more standardized data lakes as an example, and more modern solutions for managing your data, and then layering on the data governance on top of that, and enabling AI in a safe and secure manner have access to that data to surface the results that the organization is looking for.
Craig, how do you temper, when a company's moving to the cloud, there's really two parts. There's this modernization piece that we're looking at, we're re-architecting and doing, and then there's operations that are going, and there's a legacy environment in there that we have to deal with. How do you make that trade-off between what should go, what should remain legacy, and what we should modernize? And what I'm wondering if you could bring up, if there's been, I guess, a memorable case where you've had to deal with that you could tell us about.
Well, as much as I'm a technologist, I'm also a business person, and so I look at investments in technology not just because of the wow factor of, hey, it's the latest and greatest technology, let's jump in and test it out. There's also a business angle that looking at the useful life of previous technology investments and not just jumping to the next shiny object. Those technology investments that are deemed legacy may have a useful life of 1 or 2 years, and then the business no longer has a need for that, or there's going to be some SaaS solution or some other service that's going to replace it. So in that case, leave it in legacy. There's no point in making an investment to migrate it to the cloud, maybe migrate it as is, but just leave it untouched, because just because it's legacy doesn't mean it's bad. Where it's gonna, if the legacy solution is gonna hold you back from adopting additional technologies, that's maybe where the investment decision is worth making.
Going forward, there's a lot of questions that we've covered, and the one thing that I want to ask you, is there a question that I should have asked you that I haven't asked you yet?
That's a good question. You're putting me on the spot here, Brice. I think, if we go back to the people side of things and your audience being, the head of architecture and that side of things, I think the question that is probably on their minds is, how can I help? How can I skill up to know more about FinOps, or how can I learn to incorporate FinOps thinking in my everyday processes? So number one, I'm a big fan of the FinOps Foundation. It's an open source community. They put all their information out there for free. So I'm always steering people in that direction, going to finops.org and research the information there. So learning what FinOps is all about, not for your audience to become FinOps practitioners, but just to learn the concepts and how important it is at every step of the technology process. So, and architecture is really in that early stage thought process. And if the operating costs from a FinOps perspective in the cloud are not considered when a solution is being designed, then there's a risk that you're going to see runaway costs once it's deployed.
Yeah, absolutely. Great answer. Thanks, Craig. Craig, this has been a pleasure having you on the discussion. I'm hoping we can follow up again. We covered a lot of ground,
100%.
and I think we've just got the surface of what FinOps is.
Yes, I believe so, and it's something I'm very passionate about, so I appreciate the invitation, Brice, and if your audience wants to reach out, they can, I'm sure, get in touch with me through yourself.
Excellent. Thanks again, Craig. Great to have you on board.
Thank you. Take care.